I know it's early and this is very disruptive, but how are you seeing all these changes to trade and tariffs? How are you seeing that affect supply chains in general so far?
Well, it's basically for anybody who hasn't been paying attention, it's throwing everybody for a loop, especially if you have a small business and maybe you haven't, sort of paid attention to the election cycle here in the US, which I don't blame you if you haven't. It gets a little exhausting at times, but textiles, so clothing, toys, these are typically commodities that are low margin items. And most of them, majority of them, are imported from China, other Southeast Asian countries, and so if you haven't been paying attention, then your business has probably been upended what feels like overnight. For many other companies, they are doing what's called front loading, and so typically in the supply chain year, what you'll see is right after Christmas, typically you have a lot of returns, and so there's a lot of return management that's going on. There's also a lot of purchasing that's going on ahead of the Chinese New Year, which typically falls at the end of January. But this year in particular was a little bit more volume was being ordered and being front loaded. That's the term that they use in supply chain and logistics, where you're buying so much more goods ahead of time. So typically you're already buying much more goods in order to anticipate the Chinese New Year, which all of the factories and manufacturing shut down for a period of a couple weeks because people are at home with their families. But this year in particular, it's not, they're front loading even more so because they knew that the tariffs were going to be coming down under Trump's, Liberation Day is what he called it on April 2nd, when he instituted, just global tariffs across the board and then started to ease some of those tariffs on other countries. I think there's a 90-day pause that's going on right now, like, for all countries except for China. And so it's been a little bit of an eventful few months, but for a lot of companies, especially a lot of warehousing in North America, so Canada, Mexico, the US, they're storing a lot of goods and in anticipation of what was going to happen on Liberation Day. And so this is where we kind of find ourselves now. If you haven't been paying attention, then you're probably scrambling. If you were paying attention, then you have a little bit more of I guess a little bit more of a break where you can kind of see, you can kind of have a wait and see approach on what's going to happen, because it's changing seemingly by the hour every day. So it's tough to keep up with a lot of these different announcements.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not an economist, but from what I understand, the intent of the tariffs, at least from the United States perspective, is to basically force manufacturers and companies to move more manufacturing and sourcing back home to the U.S. That clearly isn't going to happen overnight. You can't just build a factory or a big distribution center in the U.S. just because we're getting tariff now. So, what's the reality of how is this affecting sourcing strategies and just the way the supply chains are built in general? Are you seeing any movement or changes yet on that front? I know it's really new, but what are people saying they plan to do, or are
Well,
they saying?
in a very similar way to in 2020, we all know what happened during that year, and that tend to expedite. That was the first. I guess I should back up a little bit. That during 2020, that was the first time that the general American public, generally the world, kind of found out where a lot of their goods were coming from, and
Mm,
in some cases, it became a wake up call. And so, what you started to see was what's called a nearshoring effort. And so, with nearshoring, you are moving some of your sourcing and some of your products and assembly, you're moving them from China into other countries. So India, Vietnam, Cambodia, even to an extent. A lot of these countries have set up several shops for manufacturing purposes. And then what they have is, it's called a China plus one strategy, where the majority of the world is getting some kind of sourcing, some kind of inputs from China, but then they're going to source those products from China, transfer them, ship them over to another country for assembly. A lot of times that is now transitioning into assembly in Mexico or assembly in Canada, much more so on the Mexico side of things. And so we've seen a lot of nearshoring efforts over the last 5 years. To your point, it takes a long time for manufacturing to come back. Some would argue that it shouldn't take that long. There's some companies that are kind of, dragging their feet. Apple, I think, is a great example of an American company that is fully dependent on a foreign supply chain in order to manufacture their goods. We saw around the April 2nd, tariff deadlines, or the I guess the tariff announcements that Apple was chartering 5 different planes in order to ship a lot of their iPhones out of Southeast Asia into the United States in order to avoid some of those extra costs. And so what I think we're seeing is that we're seeing an acceleration in things that were already happening. Now, for a lot of businesses, it's still going to be tough for them to find the component of the component or even the machine that makes the machine. That's been the biggest problem with reshoring of American manufacturing, is that during the 90s, when essentially all of these manufacturing processes were shipped out of the United States, they were shipped over, but also we lost that knowledge base. And
Yeah.
so when you're talking about bringing some of that manufacturing back, we frankly don't have enough of the knowledge base of what it takes to make the component of the component, the machine that builds the machine. There are some interesting companies that are trying to do that in the United States and have been trying to do that for a few years now. If you're going to bring manufacturing back, what does that actually look like in a modern day sense? Are we going to bring everything back, or are other things like toys and textiles? Does it make more sense to just let other countries handle that part of the job? And so there's a lot of questions that are being asked right now, but it's also a situation where some of these things were already happening, and now it's just further incentive to we have to also discuss the lack of incentives for a lot of these, manufacturing, I guess, initiatives to take place. The biggest difference between U.S. and China is that China subsidizes a lot of their manufacturing capabilities, where they will pick certain industries that they will subsidize, versus the United States, where it's kind of like, figure it out. Like,
Yeah.
it's up to you to figure it out, and both have pros and cons.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. And I actually posted something on LinkedIn about the tariffs, and someone commented on that about how the U.S. is at a disadvantage because China is subsidizing certain industries and they can kind of play that long game. And I don't know, they don't seem to be blinking yet in terms of wanting to bring down their tariffs or to end the trade war. And to be fair, neither is the United States so far, except they have made exceptions for Apple or for computers and cell phones, which I imagine was Apple's doing, because it was really interesting. I just read an article about the CEO of Apple and about how he came up through the ranks building that global supply chain that's highly dependent on China. And I remember it was either that day or the next day was when the U.S. came out and said that they were going to make an exception for Apple. So I don't know if I imagine he's lobbying, or people like him are lobbying for exceptions from these tariffs. But other than Apple and computer and chip manufacturers, things like that, are there other industries or types of companies that are most affected by these trade wars?
Well, many industries, because like I said earlier, there are very few components. So the components is like the source of the product. Many of those are still all coming from China. And so it very much, or Southeast Asia. And then from the manufacturing landscape, they're out what China has done over the last 5 years, because this isn't the first time, Trump has kind of declared a trade war with China. He did it during his first term. And so for a lot of a lot of Chinese companies during that time frame, what they did is that they set up companies in Mexico, they set up companies in Vietnam, Chinese owned companies, that they're just another, I don't want to say a shell company, but they're another division, or another, division is probably the best word for it, but they're setting up another shop in another country, and then they're trying to avoid the tariff laws in that realm, or in that part of the world. And so that was the way that they kind of got around a lot of these tariff rules that were put in place during the first Trump administration. And then now we're coming into the second Trump administration. And for the Trump sort of economic team, what their strategy was is just cut everybody off at the knees and then manage the exceptions. That's how I'm kind of reading into it. It's,
Yeah.
for better or worse, I don't want to, I guess get into the political realm of things, of who I support and who I don't support, but I do get it from just a bearish approach, where you're just going to cut everything and then wait for the loudest cries. And then from those loudest cries, like an Apple, who has been solely dependent on, a foreign government for their entire supply chain, it's forcing them to have some tough conversations as well. They have shifted some of their manufacturing into neighboring countries. Vietnam and India are some of the big winners so far. But they really should be doing much more with the enormous amount of cash balance that they have. I mean, it's more than, some countries' GDP. And
Yeah.
so it's a little bit of okay, we'll throw you a bone here, I think, from the Trump administration, if I'm reading between the lines, specifically when it comes to Apple. But they really should be. It's an American company. It's completely reliant on foreign entities, and so it's probably about time that a company like Apple was bringing their all of their products back. Now, it's still a knowledge base gap.
How are you seeing that affect supply chains in general so far?